Yes, good afternoon, my students, colleagues, friends in Brazil. And good afternoon, friends from the universities, different universities in Brazil as well. And good evening, friends in Ireland and in Europe. And bonsoir, mon ami, à Paris. So you can see many people are watching us, attending this conversation, this chat. And thank you all for coming and joining us this afternoon or this evening again. Everybody knows that we've been using this space to share experiences and disseminate knowledge as if you were in our classroom. Okay. Because of the pandemic, this is the only option we had. So before introducing my guest speaker, let me introduce my colleague, Monique Pfau. Monique is a PhD professor and researcher of English language and literature at the Federal University of Bahia, coordinator of Key Texts in Translation Research Group, and deputy coordinator of our group of Irish Studies at UFBA. Now, I should say we are delighted and immensely proud to have or to announce another special guest in this series of chats we have been organizing. The talented and experienced Irish writer, filmmaker, and theater director, Allan Gilsena. I'm especially honored, Alan, to have your presence among us this afternoon or this evening for you. Okay? Welcome to our virtual Bahia. Virtual Bahia.
I'm delighted to be with you all. I wish I was not virtually in Bahia. I wish I was in Bahia, but it's lovely to talk to you all. Thank you.
Okay. It's not the first time, Allan Gilsena, we will speak to our scholars in Brazil. He came to Florianopolis a few years ago, I think 2016, 15. Yes.
Then, yeah.
And it was when we all had the chance to be in touch with his work in our university. And he talked when he came to Bahia about his controversial documentary, The Road to God Knows Where, which was launched in 1988. All that at that time, he was interviewed by Professor Beatriz Kopschitz-Bastos. Am I right?
Absolutely. Wonderful, Beatrice.
Yes. I must confess that before his coming, we all, students and me and colleague Monique, we all went to Google and survey his career as a filmmaker. We were really impressed by his prolific production, considering he is still a young guy. If I start listening and describing his works here, I would not give him the chance to talk, and I'm supposed to introduce our guest. Allan Gilsena was born in County Meath in Ireland and grew up in Dublin, where he attended Trinity College. So this is the map for you have an idea where he came from. His career as a filmmaker covers a massive number of documentaries, shorts, and feature films. It's worth mentioning a few here. An acclaimed film of Samuel Beckett's TV drama, Joe, and his award-winning documentary for the UK's Channel 4 that I have mentioned before, The Road to God Knows Where, which was edited by Lance Pettit and Beatriz Kopschitz in 2015 as A Estrada para Deus Sabe Onde. and published by UFSC, Federal University of Santa Catarina. This bilingual critical edition comprises Gilsenan's screenwriting, his own reflective words on the film, critical essays by Harvey O'Brien's and Ruth Barton, as well as a translations made by José Roberto Scher from UFSC and other people from there. The documentary captures the spirit of transformation of Ireland in the decade of the 80s through impressive words and visual images. Still, this is the front cover of the book, the red one. Still, what called my attention most when I read Gilsenan's career in film was the documentaries he wrote on complex and challenging aspects of life experiences. These include the Asylum, a 4-hour portrait of portraying psychiatric hospitals, the hospice inside St. Francis Hospice, the Home about old age, I See a Darkness about suicide in Ireland, and A Time to Die on euthanasia. These things are so specific that made me think about the content of each one. My first question could come from these themes. Why did you write about them? Any special reason to deal with these gloomy issues? Do the roots of your filmmaking come from a particular experience in life? My students and I also have watched a few documentaries. The documentaries on the folk singer Liam Clancy, entitled The Yellow Bittern, A Vision, very impressive, A Life of the W.B. Yeats. I particularly love Yeats' work. Daniel O'Connell, Forgotten King of Ireland, etc. So concerning this last one, I learned so much, because every time I go to Ireland and I go up and down the street, O'Connell Street, I didn't know anything about O'Connell. So it was a good opportunity. Thank you. We had a special meeting to discuss these works, and we all agreed how dazzling and insightful these documentaries are. Talking to Professor José Roberto from UFSC about you on the telephone a few days ago, he said something about your films, which I try to translate, because I also agree with José Roberto when he said, translating, I'm not a specialist in films, but what is evident in Gilsenan's film, even in his documentaries, is the poetry of his visual and sound languages. He's a poet of images and sounds. José Roberto was, okay? José Roberto was really impressed because you could make documentaries which are meant to be something plain and accurate with no poetry. So poetic. The other point I want to stress is it seems your career in films is not so much contaminated with national issues or transnational issues as the works of the other Irish filmmakers we have been examined so far. Am I right? Or am I right? Another aspect of your career in film that called my attention is the presence of relevant names of Irish literatures. Samuel Beckett, Roger Casement, Paul Durcan, Tom Murphy, Patrick Pearson. The impression I had by examining your fruitful career in films is your purpose in keeping iconic names of your history and culture alive? As far as your career in theater, I would like to say it's not less relevant. I could see the choices you have made in terms of plays for the theater. English playwright Shakespeare, French playwright Jean Day Dennett, Scottish playwright David Harrow, American playwright Tennessee Williams, British playwright Steve Barkov, and of course, Irish playwrights Tom Banville and Tom Murphy. So my conclusion here is that your work is deeply in tune with Irish history, culture, and literature. We are really happy because it was a great chance we all had. Go into your work, investigate, reading, watching the films, documentary. Thank you for this great opportunity, Alan, and for accepting to come and join us this afternoon. Okay.
So,
your turn now.
Noélia, thank you for that, the very kind and generous introduction. And I might, if I may, just before we start, just mention a young Brazilian man called Diego Cortez, who tragically on Monday night was killed in a hit and run accident. He was doing food deliveries. And tonight in Dublin, there has been a kind of candlelit vigil to remember him. And I think it's probably, in the context of this Irish-Brazilian exchange, probably appropriate that we remember him. There are, as you know, deep academic and cultural links between Ireland and Brazil. And in recent years, many, many young Brazilians have come to make to work and to learn English and to live in Ireland amongst us. And you know, it's very sad, and you know, everybody in Ireland shares that sorrow at Diego's tragic death. So, but thank you for your introduction, as I say. You know, I'm quite touched by what Jose said about the poetic element, and it is certainly something that draws me. And I have, you know, as you mentioned, done a lot of work in very different forms, in very different mediums. And often it's easier for other people to see themes and threads through your work than yourself. For me, I think it's always primarily intuition and instinct that leads me to approach something. I mean, there is a certain amount of thought sometimes, but I think my approach is primarily instinctual, and I'm drawn always to, you know, the poetic, you know, because I think in a way that gets to the essence of life experience. And but none of this is conscious. You know, when people say it, I can probably see the threads of consistency. But I don't particularly think like that myself. I take each project for what it is, and then I just hopefully go on a journey of exploration and trying to understand the story I'm trying to tell.
Okay, thank you. So now we turn to Monique. Monique has a few questions for you. Thank you for your words.
Thank you, Noélia. Hello. So I'm from the field of translation studies, and I know you would not call yourself a translator, as much maybe you are not comfortable with the poet. But what I've noticed when I researched a little about your work is that you work with a lot of film adaptations. And in translation studies, we call that intersemiotic translation. So it's this practice of taking one genre, a novel, for example, and transforming it into another genre that in this case is a film. Yes. So we know that in this process, you have to make a lot of choices, what you're going to keep, what you're going to adapt, and what you're going to omit. And I would like to hear a little bit about these choices that you made. I am particularly curious about this film Unless, that I think was quite recently released, more or less, right? I didn't have the opportunity to watch, but I watched the trailer and one or two interviews about that on YouTube. And also these episodes that you've recently produced about Ulysses from James Joyce. I could see from the trailer, some episodes of Ulysses I actually managed to watch because it's available on internet, and it's very interesting and very poetic. I agree with O'Shea and Noélia, by the way. But I could see that your criteria to make choices between these two films, you could tell about others if you want, are very different. So I would like to hear a little bit about these choices that you make during this process.
Well, I think in terms of adaptation, and maybe it's similar to translation, is that I see it as you know, it's like a reading. You know, when I adapt Carol Shields' novel, great Canadian novelist, it was her final novel. When I adapted that, you know, first of all, I think it has to come out of a love of the original material. You know, there has to be something in it that moves you and that stimulates you and that draws you to it. So I think, first of all, you have to approach that with respect, with love, with the feeling that you want to spend a lot of time with this piece of work, you know, because you're going to read it, reread it, and reread it. Many years ago, I did a stage adaptation of John Banville's novel, The Book of Evidence. And what was wonderful about that was because I read the book continually, and every time I read it, I uncovered something new and fresh. And, you know, as you know, that's not always the way with the book. So I think, first of all, there has to be a love, a passion, a belief that something in the original material moved you, drew you to it, sometimes for reasons you don't understand. And so, first of all, you have to love it, but then you have to respect it. Now, by respecting it, by respecting the original text, whether it's a novel like Carol Shields' Unless, or John Banville's Book of Evidence, or, you know, a huge, great, cavernous work of art like Ulysses, you certainly have to approach it with respect, but not with reverence, you know. And I suppose the act of making a film, which is an adaptation, is something that you do. It's like you're trying to create something different that is respectful, that is, it's like a little seedling thrown off from a tree. It has to be its own thing. It has to be, it is your reading of it. I mean, you mentioned the adaptation, installation, whatever you want to call it, that I made recently for Molly. There's a wonderful new museum of literature in Dublin on St. Stephen's Green called Molly, an extraordinary place that you'll all have to visit when you come here.
Yes.
And they very kindly, and in fact, the seeds of this idea happened in Florianopolis, if you will believe it, asked me to make a filmic response to Ulysses. Now, at first you think wonderful, and then your second response is, oh God, Ulysses.
Huge.
And then your third response is, God, you really are as arrogant as I thought you were, that you could even think of doing that, right? So once you get through all that neurosis, of which I have plenty, and Ulysses is a great example because it's such, you know, it's such a huge crowning glory of literature, that actually the idea of adapting it seems totally ludicrous. But yet there was something drew me to it, and it was that idea that maybe I could make a film that was my reading. You know, there is an infinite number of readings of Ulysses, and there could be potentially an infinite number of films, adaptations of Ulysses. I mean, that's the wonder of it. And the more I read Ulysses and the more I got into it, the more I began to respect Joyce's, you know, extraordinary universe of imagination, you know, that it is a book that endlessly, and I wasn't too reverent of it, actually, because I think if you're too reverent, you become fearful. But I felt that in trying to adapt, in inverted commas, or read Ulysses in film, that it had to be a kind of a personal interpretation. Obviously, to a degree, it's informed by a certain amount of research and a certain amount of learning, and a certain amount of reading about it and listening to people. But ultimately, then you have to throw all that away, and you have to follow your own instincts. You know, the same instincts that perhaps apply to a translator. You know, approaching a great work, or certainly any reader. You know, we all make our film of any piece of literature. And so that would have been the approach with Ulysses. But I suppose that's the logical line of adaptation. You know, you read it, you love it, you respect it, you learn about it, you study it. And it's almost like then you have to let that go and then just respond in whatever modest capabilities you have as an artist. You know, that it's a response to it. You know, it's like a poet writing a poem after seeing a beautiful painting. You know, it's a reflection of it. And whether you're making a relatively conventional feature film like Unless, which was a relatively conventional feature film about, you know, a conventional story in a relatively conventional novel, or you're making a kind of cinematic installation of a book that is so multifaceted and radical as Ulysses, in the end of the day, it has to be your response. And for me, that has to come from your heart. You know, that has to come from some deep emotional place, some imaginative place. You know, and I think whether it's in a very kind of experimental way, as in the Ulysses film in Molly, or whether it's in a conventional feature film like Unless, or whether it's in the documentaries that Noélia mentioned earlier, you know, that deal with very extreme situations, whether it's suicide or euthanasia or dying or mental illness. You have to bring your heart to it. You know, there has to be an emotional engagement. And in a way, because I didn't really answer your earlier question, Noélia, why am I drawn to those dark subjects, say in the documentaries? And you know, my mother used to say when I was young, and she'd see me making this litany of these very depressing films, and she'd say, "God, but you were such a happy child," you know. And I don't think I'm drawn to difficult subjects necessarily out of some deep melancholia, though we all have a bit of that. But it's somewhere in the extremes of life that we see the truth. You know, it's when you face into, you know, psychiatric illness, or face into, you know, the thought of suicide, or that it is there, you know, in the extremes of experience, you know, and thankfully most of us will never have those experiences, but it is in the extremes of experience, whether they're represented in life, in as you do in documentary, or whether they're represented in the imagination of literature, that is where truth resides. That's where our soul resides, you know. So that And I think there's always a link between those. You know, it's no coincidence that we're drawn to read poetry at a funeral, or in times of joy or despair, we reach for a piece of music. Because I think art can articulate and connect us to the truth of our hearts and experience outside the daily reality of just getting on with life.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. So, Monique, before you continue, can I ask a question? The same line about Ulysses.
Of course.
How long did you take to produce the adaptation of Ulysses?
I mean, I suppose it kind of happened over a year. I find it very hard to work out how much time anything takes, right? Now, partly that's because there's a lot of procrastination, right? There's a lot of wandering around a subject. You know, that's common to anybody involved in kind of creative pursuit. But also, I think part of that is, you know, if I'm being kind to myself, I will say that procrastination is consideration. You know, it's the time where you're mulling over ideas and you're reading around something. And then whether I'm writing a script or making a film, I do a lot of that, and then there's a sudden rush of energy at the end. And you know, I kind of beat myself up about that a lot of the time. I think, well, why couldn't you have started this, you know, 3 months ago in earnest, you know, the hard work. But I think it is, this is my excuse anyway, is that any creative process is infinite. When you sit down to write something, or to compose a piece of music, or make a film, or write an essay, there is an endless horizon of possibilities. And I find that it's almost like what you need is time compressing,
yes,
to finally make the decisions, you know. So I tend to mull over and explore things for a while, and then at the end there's a kind of rush of madness. And you know, I was writing a film script recently, and I was doing a lot of work, and I did a lot of preparation. I did all sorts of stuff, and I had charts on the wall, and I, you know, themes, and I, you know, fantastically impressive. But then I realized at the end, because it's quite an extreme subject, that you know, in the end, you always need that slight burst of insanity, which kicks in. Well, certainly with me, it kicks in at a certain point, and I become a little kind of mad, and then it gets done. So.
Thank you very much. Continue, Monique. Your next question.
All right. Yes. Actually, when he was, I think this question has a lot to do with what he was saying earlier, because you talked about your own feelings, that you have to love and you have to be passionate about that. But I always want to know, people who produce some kind of art, literature, films, if they think in the public, the readers actually. So a lot of your work seems to be dedicated to personality and stories from and about Ireland. Yeah, so I have some examples like Meeting with Ivor, The Ghost of Roger Casement, A Vision, A Life of W.B. Yeats, and The Irish Mind, and so on and so forth. Yes, and you represent Irish personalities and Irish stories. So I would like to know if these representations of Ireland are projected mainly, when you think about that, when you are doing that, you think mainly of an Irish audience, or a wider English-speaking audience, or even something more global. I don't know, maybe through your work you changed your thoughts about that too, while you get more acquainted by the others. But I would like to hear from you.
Well, Monique, you know, I do think, you know, when I make a film, I make it to the widest audience, you know. But I have made, as you rightly say, a lot of films which perhaps are even obsessively about Ireland or Irish characters. And they're generally about people that I respect, that I am intrigued by, that I want to get to know, like Roger Casement or Daniel O'Connell or Yates or Paul Durkin or whoever. So it's almost a journey of kind of friendship in a way, of getting to know even retrospectively. You know, I remember when I was making the film on Roger Casement, who, as many of you know, is a complex and contradictory figure in Irish life, but also was a hugely important humanitarian figure, you know, and did great work both in the Amazon, in Brazil and Peru, but also in the Congo. And but I remember when I was making the film with him, we were filming his grave, and Casement's remains had a very strange journey home. But he ended up in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin, and there's a beautiful grave as you go in the gate. And I remember almost talking to him at the grave and saying, "Okay, Roger, now guide me here. You know, I don't want to stop." Right? So I do, in some kind of weird way, feel a strange kind of communion that Yates would probably appreciate. But anyway, you know, so there is, you know, I can see in a lot of the work I've done, there is a passionate interest in Ireland, and I'm very passionate about Ireland, and love where I live, and I'm not uncritical, but I'm very proud of the country I come from. So that's one aspect, but at the same time, there is something that draws me to other places, you know, to Brazil, which I love, but also, you know, I've made a feature film in Morocco, I made a feature film in Canada. So there's something of me too that draws me beyond out of Ireland. You know, that there's one strain of work which is a bit obsessively connected to Ireland and Irish history and literature, but I can see there's part of me wants to break free of that. And I think it's also, if you're a filmmaker and you're looking at a small country, it's almost like the visual landscape. It's almost like it's a limited palette, you know. So when you go to somewhere like Morocco, or you go to Colombia, or wherever, it's like your visual palette, your palette of paints expands. You know, so I think there's a bit of both. And I love to leave Ireland. I love to come home. So I think there's those strains, you know. And to come back to what Noélia said about not being too transnational, how I understand that is, I'm probably not that influenced. Maybe this is probably a bad thing, some of my producers will tell me, but I'm not that influenced by trends or how something will be perceived somewhere else. You know, how is this going to look in New York? You know, I want people in New York to watch it, but I think you have to be true to the material itself, you know. And, you know, to be honest, I'm not somebody who watches a huge amount of cinema. You know, I'm watching more recently, but instinctively. And, you know, I don't say this as, you know, with any pride, but it's just a fact that that certainly in the past, I would be more drawn to, you might see, music or books, you know, that somehow I would end up reading more and listening to more music than I would see films. Now, I realize that could be a lack, but that's just a fact.
Monique, your last question?
Thank you. Yes, I have one more question, and I think we...
Yes.
Yeah, actually, it's very related, and maybe, well, let's see. So I'll just read my question here. So because it's also about audience and the public and people who are paying more attention to your work now. So I would like to know what you think about productions reaching different parts of the globe, such as Brazil, where more interested in Brazil, of course, but you can talk about other parts of the world. And then what Noélia said earlier, that in Florianópolis, these colleagues from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, they released these books, Vidas Irlandesas, Irish Lives in Portuguese. And do you think your work somehow communicates differently in other parts of the world? Do you know what I mean? It's the same work, but watched by different people. So,
I mean, I think there's definitely obviously an element of difference in cultural understanding. But I suppose what I'm amazed is how much we share, you know, and how much, you know, when you show a film outside the country it was made in, you know, there may be elements of interpretation or cultural details that people miss, less so amongst yourselves because you're such students of Irish culture. But I'm always amazed at how the core of a film translates to audiences wherever they are. And I think, you know, we live in a very strange time. You know, in one way, we're far more connected than ever before. You know, we can access films from across the globe on our computer almost effortlessly. And that's a wonderful luxury. And that's a beautiful kind of communion, cultural communion. You know, even this conversation we're having this evening, we couldn't have done that 20 years ago. And yet, on the other hand, though we have this extraordinary access and obviously before COVID, we traveled and all that. But strangely, the other side of that is we seem to have become increasingly divided. You know, that the world is becoming, in lots of ways, less tolerant of each other. You know, you look at the global migration crisis. You know, you look at what's happening in North America. You know, the divisions seem to be endemic, that somehow by having all this cultural connection, in some ways we seem to be more divided in lots of respects. And actually, what watching a film does, wherever you are in the world, if you do it together, is you realize that our shared values, our shared emotions aren't that different. You know, I remember when I made a film many years ago in Morocco, and when we went in the recce a few months before the film, and we were down in the north of the Sahara, and a very nice man of Tuareg family showed us around and helped us. And when we came back to film 3 months later, he had sadly died in the interim. And so we thought, you know, this is maybe an Irish thing. You know, we kind of love death. You know, we're very fond of funerals. But anyway, we decided we would go and visit this man's family in this very small village in the Sahara, just to, you know, express our sympathy, you know, and say we're sorry. So we arrived at this very humble dwelling in the Sahara, and our translator explained who we were and that we'd come to say how sorry we were that their son had died. And you know, they brought us in and we sat around, and they brought tea out and we drank tea, and we didn't say anything really because, you know, we had no shared language. And when we left, you know, they said through the translator, you know, well, you're now family, you know, come anytime. And it seemed in that little exchange, that simple, humble little, you know, that whoever you are, wherever you're living in the world, the core things in life you understand. And I think film touches on those things: love, death, you know, sex, violence, you know, war, romance. That all those core experiences we share, you know, and so when you show a film, I think people respond to those things. And you know, and of course there's differences. influence. I don't want to turn this into some sort of we're all happy clappy together, but I think that art, in the broadest sense, has a unifying presence among humanity, wherever it is.
Yes.
Thank you.
So now we'll move to our scholars' questions. Thank you.
Yes, they have some questions.
Oh, I'm in trouble now. The scholars are coming out.
Rosilaine Costa, the first one.
So I'll just read the question, okay?
Yes,
Back in 2001, you wrote and directed the award-winning short film Zulu 9. Currently, I guess, you are in the fighting words team. How has it been for you to allow people to speak for themselves instead of you speaking for them? And then,
yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, just to explain, first of all, Fighting Words is a wonderful organization that I'm honored to be on the board of, which was set up by Roddy Doyle, the Irish novelist, and Sean Love. And it's a creative writing center for young people. And that's what the questioner is referring to, which has centers across Ireland and encourages young people, to write and be creative in the context of an education system that doesn't always allow for creativity. But to come back to the question, I suppose when you're making a documentary, as I have done, your responsibility in a way is to allow them, the people that you're making the film with, to express themselves. And then when you're making a more personal project, a drama or some more experimental or poetic work, that's your chance to express yourself, so I see that distinction. So being involved a little in Fighting Words, I don't see any great difference between allowing or trying to encourage young people to write and sing and be creative, and allowing people that you're making a documentary with. Because I think when you're making a documentary, particularly with people in a sensitive area, you have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, to help them to give voice to their story. So I don't see that much of a difference. But what I would say about Fighting Words is, and I'm struck every time I go in, there's an extraordinary energy in the place. If you go into Fighting Words, and they're now centers across Ireland, and you have all these young people, from as little as 4 or 5 right up to, students writing, creating, it's always kind of magical, and it reminds you, because it's often film, there's a lot of nonsense, and there's a lot of raising money, and there's a lot of, but when you see people being creative, young people being creative, it reminds you of your initial impulse, So in actual fact, Fighting Words, I think, gives me a kind of inspiration. Same if I talk to film students, you're reminded of the privilege that you have to make films, and you're also reminded of that initial impulse and the joy and the fun and the excitement of it, So, yeah.
Thank you. The next one is Lara.
Lara Rebecca. So she asks, in Liam Clancy's life and times, there are some comments on the civil rights movement and on what Irish immigrants used to think about Black people. Her question is quite long. Liam Clancy even says that as an Irishman who was an immigrant in the USA, his people used to suffer with prejudice. Nowadays, it's less common for Irish people to receive this kind of treatment, and Ireland has been receiving an increasing number of immigrants. Many of these immigrants are Black people from African countries. How do you see this matter in today's Irish society?
Okay, well, Lara, that's a very detailed question and complex one, but I'll try and answer it. First of all, that for people who don't know, Liam Clancy is a very famous Irish folk singer. He was part of the Clancy brothers and Tommy Makem, who are kind of legendary. You know, if you go into any Irish bar anywhere in the world, you'll see pale imitations of the Clancy brothers singing Irish songs, you know. So if you want to hear the real thing, listen to the Clancy brothers and Tommy Makem. But just going back to the first part of the question, you know, the Clancy brothers came to fame in America in the late 50s and 60s. They were a huge sensation, at one point outselling the Beatles in America. And they came of age in Greenwich Village in all that kind of excitement of the 60s, you know. And at one point, they started doing benefit gigs, you know, supporting what today we know as Black Lives Matter, you know. And they were amazed to find that a lot of Irish people wouldn't go and see them because they were prejudiced, you know. And this is a very complex issue in Ireland and something that has become very current. You know, Ireland was, you nearly wouldn't see a black face on the street in Ireland 20, 25 years ago, you know. And now the country is increasingly multicultural. But just without giving too much of a history lesson, there is a context in that Irish immigrants to America were often socially just one step ahead of the blacks. You know, in the plantation, the black slaves were seen at the bottom of the pile and the Irish were just like the foreman, you know. So while Irish people, understandably and rightly, like to side with the oppressed, you know, culturally, socially, we feel because of our history of colonization, you know, of being a dispossessed people, we like to, and I think this is genuine, we like to empathize with the underdogs, you know, and that's reflected in Ireland's involvement in the United Nations. Historically, Irish missionaries going around the world, that there was something implicit in Irishness, which was to side with the underdog, you know, because we were underdogs ourselves. And you know, that's famously, you know, in the 50s and 60s in London, there used to be signs on the door. If people were renting a room or an apartment, they would be signs in the windows, and this is fact, which said no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Yeah. So we feel an empathy for people of color, or we like to think it. But as I mentioned earlier, the complexity, say, in the North American situation was that actually we weren't always as kind as we like to think. You know, that often in America, Irish people could be very racist, could be very harsh on their black neighbors, partly maybe, and this is kind of sociological surmising, because we were one step above them on the ladder, you know, and everybody else was kicking us, so we felt we had to kick somebody. So, I mean, that's a kind of long-winded way of giving context, that on the one hand, we have this Irish sense, which is genuine, you know, that we want to side with the underdog, with people who've also experienced colonization and oppression. But on the other hand, we haven't always been these great saints. So now when Ireland is becoming increasingly multicultural and we have, you know, black faces on the street, and we really have to face up to the reality of that. You know, Irish people always like to think we're not racist, you know, and I'd like to think that we aren't. You know, there is part of me part of me feels, you know, that I want to stick to that myth, you know, and that Irish people are fundamentally decent, and I think they are, and that they fundamentally look for the good in people, whoever they are. But I think in the current world we're living in, and in the context of all that's been happening in Black lives in America, you know, I think we need to be cognizant of our own implicit racism and our own, you know, I have, you know, a mixed race daughter, and I know she's experienced racism on the streets of Dublin, and many of her friends who are people of color have also experienced that. So I think we can't get too comfortable in our high-mindedness. You know, I think we have to be alert to all our own innate prejudices. Sorry, that's a kind of long answer. Long question.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next one?
So a quite delicate issue. Yeah. The next one.
I think some people in YouTube also want to make questions. Lara has another one? Yes.
Yes. In the end of Liam Clancy's life and times, it's played song Parting Glass. Is there a specific reason for the choice?
Well, that's an easier one. First of all, I think strangely there are two versions of the Liam Clancy film. The Yellow Bittern was a feature-length documentary, and then for sort of practical reasons, we had to make a kind of a television version, which was called The Life and Times of Liam Clancy, which I think is the one Lara's referring to. But anyway, The Parting Glass is a very famous Irish song, folk song, made famous really by Liam Clancy. It's a very beautiful song. And The Parting Glass is, you know, it's the last drink at the end of the night. Now, I know you Brazilians know nothing about this, and none of you would dream of having a drink at night. But in an Irish drinking situation, the parting glass was this, you know, it was the last one. It was the last one before you say goodbye. And
one on the road. Is it
a saideira?
No, one for the road probably comes about 3 glasses before the parting glass. As you know, language isn't always accurate in Irish life. So the parting glass is both, you know, an elegiac goodbye, you know, which signals the end of something, the end of life, the end of an evening. But it's also that last drink of the night, and it's a really beautiful song, which Liam sang, you know, really beautifully. So it's a kind of iconic song, and that's why we end with it.
Thank you. So James Spalding now asking, even today we aren't saints. Okay, I think he's commenting on the previous the before the previous one. Oh, can you go back? I haven't finished reading. Thank you. So even today we aren't saints. There is still direct provision, systemic racism of all kinds.
And I absolutely agree with James. I mean, he is absolutely right. You know, direct provision, which the current government, you know, direct provision is a kind of, it's a kind of effectively putting new immigrants in Ireland into kind of camps, and you know, the current government accepts that was a mistake, and they're trying to close them down. But I think James is absolutely right. You know, we are by no means saints.
I think nobody is, huh? Okay, so now I have Sanya. Back when you were part of Irish Film Board, what guided the decisions to provide funding for filmmakers?
Before you answer Sanya's question, let me introduce Sanyo. Sanyo is my advisee. He is doing his doctorate on Irish films. So,
right. Okay. So I better not mess up. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Yes, I was on the Irish Film Board, which is the state agency which supports film. you know, how any state agency funds any cultural work, you know, is a complex business. You know, I mean, to answer the question, you know, as one member of the board, you know, you might have had input into a broader discussion, but the decisions are primarily made by the executive, maybe with the input of one or two board members, certainly at the time I was there. You know, so I think, you know, my input, you know, I'd be overstated to say it had a huge influence. But I think there is always, you know, I know from being on the film board and other organizations, it's a very complex mix, you know, particularly with film, because on the one hand, you're trying to, well, first of all, there's very large sums of money involved in film, you know, by comparison to other art forms. And with those large sums of money comes certain kind of business imperatives, you know. You know, so in any sort of state funding for film, you're trying to balance, you know, a cultural remit, a creative remit, with a business remit that demands a certain return, a certain success, and always in film, those things are always in balance, and it's very complicated, you know. And I think, you know, the film board, you know, like any film board, you can debate it either way. But I do think generally the film board, now I haven't been on it for many years, you know, I think they endeavor to try and hold those two things in balance, you know, the practical financial aspects and the creative aspects. And of course, the reality in my philosophy would be that you can't have one without the other. You know, if you're cynically trying to, whether you're a Hollywood studio or whatever, if you're cynically only supporting films that you think will be commercial, whatever that is, you will miss cultivating the creativity and energy that ultimately is what makes commercial films. You know, even to look at, say, the American situation, you know, if you think of people like David Lynch or Quentin Tarantino, who are now kind of icons of American cinema, or even, you know, Martin Scorsese, you know, who these are now revered mainstream figures. They wouldn't be who they are had they not, at the start, been the radical, edgy, creative people that were. So I think in any sort of funding, you have to try and balance those two energies.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you.
Thank
Anybody
you.
else? Anybody else? No? So may I conclude? So
Oh, one more. So one more from Sanyo again. So his question is Olivia O'Leary. Sorry, I'm not sure how to read that. O'Leary was the writer. Sorry?
O'Leary.
O'Leary. So Olivia O'Leary was the writer and presenter of Daniel O'Connell, Forgotten King of Ireland. She knows a lot about O'Connell. How was it to work with her?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting.
Sorry, it's the question continues. What is the legacy of O'Connell to Irish society?
Yeah, well, interesting question. Two parts, really. The first part, I mean, it was very unusual for me to do a film where there is somebody else effectively scripting it, and you know, it was her journey to discover the truth of Daniel O'Connell, and that was very unusual for me. And you know, the reason I did it was that Olivia O'Leary is a kind of icon of journalism in Ireland. She's a hugely respected journalist and writer in Ireland, and she has a particular passion for Daniel O'Connell, who she feels is slightly forgotten in Irish history. So in a way, that's why I agreed to do it. I remember when I met Olivia the first time, she said, "Oh, well, now I'm not very good at collaborating." So I thought, well, this could be difficult. But natural fact, we got on very well. And you know, she has a tireless you know, she has an old school journalist, tireless desire for research and for getting the truth, you know, and she really worked hard. And that was a real joy to do, you know, to go with her on this journey. And in terms of the legacy of Daniel O'Connell, despite the fact that, as Noélia said earlier, you know, O'Connell Street is the main street in Dublin, and nearly every city and town around the country has an O'Connell Street. He probably isn't as well remembered as the, in a way, the founding fathers of Ireland who led the revolution, who led the rising of 1916. You know, and I think many historians would say that the kind of blood sacrifice mythology of people like Padraig Pearse and the other leaders of the rising has kind of dominated Irish mythology for the last 100 years. Whereas Daniel O'Connell, who was an earlier generation, is really the founding father of Irish democracy and the democratic fight for independence and respect. And you know, one of the things that Daniel O'Connell had, you know, in a time when, you know, Catholics were very much second-class citizens in Ireland, was a desire without violence to try and inspire Irish Catholics to a state of equality. And that's why he's rightly remembered in Ireland. But there has always been, as probably in most countries who have had to struggle for their independence, you know, two parallel tracks, you know, one that maybe seeks or has followed the path of violence, and one that has followed a peaceful path, democratic path. And O'Connell represents, now it's obviously not that simple, you know, there are subtleties in all this, but O'Connell in the main represents the democratic path of Irish independence. You know, recently, John Hume, who many of you will have heard of, who was a wonderful leader and nationalist from Northern Ireland, who really instigated the modern peace process because he was happy, he was prepared to meet with members of the IRA and people of violence because he knew it was only through dialogue that we could get peace. And when John Hume died very recently, you know, he was rightly celebrated, but he was also remembered in the context of Daniel O'Connell, you know, like our Daniel O'Connell. So O'Connell's legacy is to be, I guess, the father of that track of Irish democracy coming down through history.
Monique, just a moment. A question still about Daniel O'Connell. By the way, can you Irish answer where his heart is?
Well, we went looking for it, I can tell you. That would have been the clue. Yeah, I mean, for people who don't know, there's a kind of great mystery about Daniel O'Connell's heart, you know. And O'Connell died finally on his way to Rome. He was on a pilgrimage. He was very ill. He was going to Rome on a sort of spiritual pilgrimage, and he died in Genoa. And his body was brought to Rome, and he famously said, or is the mythology is that he said he wanted to leave his
heart,
body to Ireland, his heart to Rome, and his soul to heaven. And so his heart was extracted from his body in Genoa and was brought to Rome in big ceremony, and there was a huge funeral in Rome because O'Connell was not just an Irish figure, he was a figure that was revered across Europe, you know, and his heart was finally entombed in the Irish College in Rome. And then many years later, when the Irish College moved from its old location to its present location, which is now near the Pantheon or near the Colosseum, they discovered that the heart had disappeared. So there's always been this great mystery about O'Connell's heart, and of course there's a metaphorical question there. But we did go in search of O'Connell's heart, but sadly we didn't find it. But as Olivia says, his heart resides in all of us.
Yes.
So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.
Do we have more questions? I think that's it.
That's it. So
Yes.
may I conclude by thanking you all for coming here this afternoon to attend the event online, to sit down and stay for an hour. So my heartfelt thanks go to you, Alan, for your generosity. It was very nice to have you with us this afternoon to share your experience in filmmaking. We are very happy, we could kill our curiosity. I believe all of us are very happy with your answers because your speech was really superb. And I thank you, Monique, for your presence to share this moment with me and all my colleagues and students, researchers who are in the backstage, Lara, Sânio, Roselaine, Manuel, Fernando, Glauber, Lucas, and many others. So thank you all. And I hope to see you next time or next week, because next week you have a Brazilian photographer, Elise, who is coming to share, who lives in Ireland, and she's going to share her experience with us.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all. And hopefully sometime we will all meet either in Brazil or in Ireland.
Yes.
Yes, not virtually. Yes.
I hope to share a glass of Guinness in Ireland.
Yes, we'll have a sparkling glass.
What?
We'll have a sparkling glass. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, mine is cheers. Thank you very much. Thank you, Noélia, for inviting me, and thank you for inspiring talk, Alan. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Alan. Good evening. Oh, good night.